From the air, it looks like an ocean of grass. No horizon, just a flat, breathing green that shimmers until your eyes hurt. From the wheelhouse, it looks like work. A tiller under my palm, an engine that wants to sing, a GPS that usually tells me where tourists are and where they can be kept safely amused for an hour. I'd done that route 1,000 times. I knew every dead cypress, every crooked palmetto, the lazy eddies that would tell you a channel was hiding under a carpet of sawgrass. I'd been called Ray my whole life. In Coopertown, that's the kind of name you keep, because the swamp remembers it, even if you don't. It was 3 in the afternoon when the instruments went strange. The GPS blinked like a wounded thing, the coordinates skipping like bad teeth. The compass, old brass, my grandfather's, the one I kept in a leather sheath because a good compass is a faith that works even when batteries fail, started to spin the way a clock spins after a quake. Not a jitter, a full, steady, lazy circle. I thought at first it was a magnet in someone's phone. I looked at the panel and the tiller and the wake. Everything was ordinary except the needle. Maybe we're getting into a pocket, I said, because I am a professional, and professionals speak as if they have a plan. People looked over their seats. The tourists on my boat were the regular mix. Mrs. Delqua, Eleanor, she said, 82 and wearing a straw hat she refused to take off, even when the wind tried. Wayne and Patty Bowman, middle-aged, careful with cameras and marriage. Luciana, a grad student in marine biology with a notebook and a patient skepticism, and a quiet kid who sat hunched forward as if his knees were holding him in. He had a cheap paper map folded into quarters and a hardness in his jaw like the kind they hand out in the hospital when they tell you someone is missing. Kyle Denning, he told me his name when the compass kept circling like it wanted to reach the boat and drag it into the grasses. He said he'd been here before. Lost, he used the word, and I had to make that make sense on a public tour. People laugh off lost on these tours. They revel in the idea of being swallowed by the swamp from the safety of a rail. This was different. There was a weight to Kyle's admission, a memory pressing like a thumb. I was out here for 3 days, he said. And he didn't say it like a tourist showing off survival chops. He said it like someone announcing a criminal record. 3 days to me, 17 minutes in Key Largo. His eyes darted around, collecting faces as if to test them. I got something, an old paper, from an elder. He slid the paper out from the inner pocket of a jacket that had seen better winters. The corner was browned. Someone had once penned rules on it with a shaky hand. He offered it up like a thing he was ashamed to carry. The tourists nudged closer, the way a school bottlenose will turn in to see a handout. I felt the professional instinct again and pushed it down. Keep them calm, keep the voice neutral, keep the tour on script. "We're in the Everglades," I said. "Weather can do things to your instruments. Sun glare throws the receiver. It's nothing." I said nothing about how the sky was a bad glass today, how the sun sat 3 fingers above the horizon and refused to go. I said nothing about the way the grasses seemed to be leaning away from us, as if the swamp itself were listening. Kyle read the rules to us slow, the letters like a rosary. He didn't want us to try them. He wanted us to know. He read them because he thought knowing might keep us alive. Because, he said, the swamp keeps track of names. He read them in order. The paper's edges crinkled. The voice in him changed when he spoke them aloud, drier, like a man rehearsing a confession. Rule 1. Do not trust a moving sun. If the sun stays, do not set your watch by it. Rule 2. Do not answer the voices that are not beside you. The swamp remembers what was said. It tries to get you to say more. Rule 3. Do not sleep where water remembers your name. Rule 4. Do not break any offering left for the center. Do not take what the dead left willingly. Rule 5. Names matter. If you must call the lost, use a name you carry like a debt. Speak it into boiled water 3 times and let the words sink. Rule 6. If the sky bruises, purple like rotten fruit, move to the cypress dock and stand on the 3rd plank until the watching passes. He folded the paper again like it could be hidden. "That last one," he said, swallowing. "That one's for the center, for the dock." He had the look of a person who was both relieved and frightened that we were listening. He had that look because if any of those rules mattered at all, then the thing that had taken his father might still be out there asking for its ledger. I kept the engine steady and steered for the nearest sandbar, because you do what you can with what you've got. Airboats don't like to stop in thick grass, they like to skim over it. But I could feel the instruments open a bruise in the world. The GPS showed us a dot in the middle of nothing, a coordinate that felt like a joke. The compass rotated like it wanted to rewrite the map. Mrs. Delcroix clutched something small in her pocket. I caught the edge of a rosary or a charm or a pressed photograph. She wouldn't show it. Wayne checked his watch, then his camera, then his wife. Patty asked what we were going to do. Luciana took a picture of the compass, the way students photograph rare birds. Clinical, detached. She muttered something about electromagnetic interference, about metal deposits, and I admired her for having a jargon to hide behind. "We could head back," Wayne suggested, "because Americana works on the idea that the map can solve anything." "We can try," I said. But the map, that thing we trust, was dishonest now. The grasses were swallowing landmarks. Cypress islands blinked out like bad signals. We passed the same dead cypress 3 times in the space of 10 minutes. Passing it once is what tells you you're en route. Passing it 3 times is a joke the swamp tells you to test your patience. Kyle, who had been quiet, watched me the way someone watches a surgeon. "There's something you need to know," he said, "about Thomas." Thomas Denning was his father. The name sat heavy on the air like the smell of duckweed. "He went out with me the first time," Kyle said. "Then he stopped answering me. I thought he walked off to get help. I thought he drowned. I thought 100 things. I think he stayed. I think the swamp kept him." You can't be a guide without a ledger of responsibilities in your head. People's weight, fuel, tides, tide of disease, the statistical improbability of things. I had a list of contact numbers, rules about how loud you could play country on a public boat. Guilt is not in that ledger usually. Guilt is a late fee the swamp charges. "We need to make camp," I said, partly to sound proactive and partly because it was true. The sky had gone mute. Even the dragonflies were thin-lipped. A boat is a moving island, and a tree island is an island within an island, and I chose one with a spit of white sand and a ring of palmettos that would hide us from the worst wind. We tied the boat to a cypress root with the kind of knot my uncle taught me. It's a small ritual that keeps you believing in the world. I put out life jackets, counted heads, did the friendly guide banter because we all cling to rituals that make the dark tolerable. We rationed water and snacks, folded sunscreen into faces, made coffee the way people make peace with the future, one small warm thing in a cold night. I could see the boat's wake threading behind us like a scab. The GPS latched onto a number and then gave up. The compass kept waving. The sun sat frozen at 3 fingers above the horizon like an insult. That first night there was a silence heavy enough to open a wound. It wasn't the quiet of the swamp you read about in postcards. It was a held breath. The mosquitoes didn't sing. The frogs had gone to bed. If you've been on a boat in the Everglades, you know how a night asks questions. Distant engines like whales, owls that clock in on the hour, the crickets that make tally marks across the black. This night was a question mark without an answer. Voices started low, like consonants under thunder. Mrs. Delcroix froze when she heard her husband call her name, Eleanor, from just beyond the palmettos. He said the things husbands say when they don't mean to be cruel. "Remember me, I'm here, come to me." Mrs. Delcroix's hands tightened on the straw hat. She did not answer. Kyle sat with his knees drawn up, the paper folded into his palm like a talisman. "They want an answer," he muttered. "They want you to say something they can keep." He had the half-mad look of someone who had been given a bargain and was waiting for the fine print. Rule 2. It gnawed at us. Voices like the city tilt a little closer when you talk back. You can sing into an empty room all night and the room remains empty. But the swamp? It writes you on the wall if you let it. We watched people test it with words they should not have used. Wayne whispered his father's nickname out of habit and then slapped his mouth like he'd burned himself. Patty laughed, a sound that was all false teeth and fear. Luciana, rational Luciana, sat with a small recorder, scanning, analyzing the frequency. If you're a scientist, you must collect data. It's an ethic. She told us later she heard layering. The present voice overlaid with the voice the swamp remembered, like an old radio playing past and present at the same time. The thing about layered voices is you can answer one without realizing you answered the other. We kept watch in shifts that night. We forced ourselves to stay awake because Rule 3 was a lie you could not afford to test. Do not sleep where water remembers your name. People sleep on boats all the time. Exhaustion is a swamp's best tool. You let your eyelids fold and the world folds you in like a letter. I brewed more coffee than any sane man should have consumed and kept the engine purring at low idle because sound keeps the room of the world lit. At 2 a.m., the swamp decided to teach us geometry. I had been dozing, fingers on the tiller, the boat bobbing like a lullaby, when a reflection slid across the water that wasn't mine. It was like seeing your own face through a window smeared with oil. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moon, but the moon didn't exist that night. The sun had frozen, remember? This was a man in a boat that looked too much like mine. He had my jaw and my hands and the scar on the left wrist I got when a line snapped in the shipyard at 19. He waved. He waved with the wrong hand. You should know something about reflections down here. The swamp isn't clean glass. It gives you versions of yourself that could have been. Echo walkers, the old-timers call them. Reflections that learn to walk. They keep the gestures you never made and the words you didn't say. They walk through the sawgrass like people whose lives split into two and both halves wanted to be whole. I felt that tug at the chest, like the world was asking me if I wanted to trade. For what? A second chance? The life I let slip? The night I said nothing? There is always a cost when you bargain with a place that remembers debt. I stepped forward because a man is a creature of habit. You move forward to see if the animal is still your animal. The echo walked closer with my smile, my left hand lifted. It mouthed something wrong, a phrase I'd spoken to my office radio 10 years ago after a bad call. It smiled the way a mirror smiles at a face it has practiced. Don't. It was Kyle who said it. He borrowed my voice by saying mine before I could. He stood on the sandbar and pointed. Don't look at it the same way as you look at the world. The echo paused and turned its head, and in that small human motion, it almost became a man. Patty screamed then, that small high sound you hear when a body recognizes danger it can't outrun. The echo lifted its hand, in imitation, and the fingers were wrong, too brittle, like paper reciting movement. The thing that frightened me most was how my hands moved in sympathy before my mind stopped them. I took a breath, not deep but measured, like an engineer testing a gauge, and I did what I'd never taught anyone to do. I turned my back on the reflection. You do that with things that don't deserve your attention. You look away. You refuse to grant them the currency of recognition. You do not answer the voices that do not stand beside you. Rule 2 again, the paper's folded edge singing under my thumb. The echo did not like me turning away. It tried to follow, gliding across the water in a way no human should move. It moved like a bruise sliding under skin. For a heartbeat, I felt the world under my feet unfasten. The echo's shadow touched the boat. Something cold hummed through the soul and up my bones. It was as if a draft had learned the shape of a person and pressed it to the hull. I say this because I want you to understand how sanctified the ordinary is. The squeak of a line pulling taut, the smell of boiled coffee, a person's breath near your ear. Those are anchors. In the face of something that takes your face and holds it up to you, anchors become sacred. I grabbed the tiller with both hands and spun the boat the way my uncle taught me. A tight circle to make wake, to create motion. Motion is a lie, but it is also a small truth in the Everglades. Stillness allows the swamp to read you. The echo tried to catch the wake and failed. It stood on the water and slid like a shadow that had learned to be jealous of distance. Then, inexplicably, it lifted its face, like a child teaching itself expression, and mouthed a name, my name, Reyes, wrongly, like it had one letter too many. I can tell a story like a man reading a ledger. I did this, the echo did that. But what matters is the feeling of the ledger closing. The boat surged forward, and the echo, suddenly afraid of its reflection, broke apart like ripples do when a stone hits them. It folded back into the grass as if someone had pinched it behind the ear. We pulled in closer to the tree island. Hearts racing and lanterns on, we covered our faces in the way people cover their children in cartoons, practical, protective. Eleanor, I'll call her Mrs. Delqua because that's how she wanted to be known, kept whispering a name that wasn't a name. It was a long conversation with absence. Night did what nights do. It made us speak things we kept in our mouths. We told stories of the people we loved while the swamp listened and held its hands. Kyle took out the paper again and told us where Mary Billy lived, a woman who kept a list of things the swamp allowed and the swamp forbade. Mary was a local elder, a figure in the way legends have elders, her name a gate, not a fact. She had given Kyle that paper. She had told him the dock had a third plank and the water required words. He never explained how she knew, only that she did. I should have been the practical voice. I should have told them to get back into the world and wait for daylight. The rational choice would have been to go home and phone in a report. But being a guide is an odd marriage of confidence and duty. You cannot leave a man who says his father is somewhere out here without asking what the favor of the space asks of you. There is an unspoken law among guides. Someone has to take responsibility, so I took it. Part of it is arrogance. Part of it is simply not being able to sleep with the question in your chest. We rationed the last of the coffee. I took stock of the engine, checked belts, ran the fan. Luciana sat on a cooler with her knees hugging a notebook, handwriting small and precise. She was trying to write down what we had heard. Names, she wrote, layered voices, frequency shift when distance less than 3 meters. I might not have used her method, but I respected the way she looked for patterns. People need patterns to keep their fear tidy. Dawn did not come in the ordinary way. The sun rose, but like a photograph is developed slowly, colors leaching into the film. We woke with the sun still 3 fingers high, but lighter now on the air, more like a bruise becoming a stain. We voted to follow a path Kyle said he remembered, a death trail. He told us there were markers you could see if you knew what a dead thing left. A ribbon of frogs stiff as paper, a line of fish bunched on the mud, a congregation of birds that had sat down and never again took wing. I hate the word trail in the swamp. It makes it sound human. This was a line the marshes drew with things that stopped. We moved slow. The airboat operation required a hand on the tiller and another on the throttle. You maneuver by feel. The channel we found was a dark vein, a narrow cut that felt like the swamp had been opened surgically. Dead animals were legalistic and solemn. Birds with wings closed like folded hands. Fish belly up in shallow pools. A raccoon that had lain on its back with paws folded as if prayerful. It smelled like iron and old teeth. The further we went, the more I felt the present rubbing against other decades. We passed a rusted lunchbox that belonged to a kid no longer alive. It held a scratched marble and a photograph of a boy on a dock. A war-torn tin can, an old watch with no hands. Each artifact was like a bookmark someone had used to keep track of sorrow.
The swamp stacked eras like twigs, and we were living on the page where they all overlapped.
At noon, if you can call it that when the sun doesn't vote to move, the compass died altogether. It stopped spinning and pointed due east with the stubbornness of a church sign. The GPS allowed one pronounceable coordinate and then went dark like someone had pulled the battery out. The air cooled like a mouth going cold. We had a sky that pressed down and a marsh that had decided to keep its own time. "Look," Luciana said, and she pointed to something that made the entire boat fall into silence. A figure stood ahead in the channel on a long, narrow skiff. It looked like a man who had been wading the same water for 100 years. He had a hat that had seen weather, and a coat so old it could have been sewn from fog. He stood, looking at us, and for a moment I thought we had found another human. We called out. He turned. It was Thomas Denning. I don't know how else to say it. The man on the skiff had Thomas Denning's eyes. The way a person's eyes look when their life wrote itself certain and then stopped. There was salt and a lichen curtain in his beard and a name in the way he kept his shoulders. He moved like someone who had owned a life and was very surprised to have it back. Kyle made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and then the man on the skiff lifted his hand. He called for his name, not Kyle's, not the thing we had all expected. He called for Thomas. "Dad!" Kyle shouted and pushed the throttle. The airboat surged forward, because when a man in front of you is the consciousness of your absence, you do not loiter. Thomas's skiff was a thin shape that slid through the water like a fingernail down music. He was a man out of time, and the boat he stood on was older than the traffic on Tayamiami Trail. His voice came like something rolled down a hill and uncoiled, older than Kyle's. It was weathered, slightly abridged by salt. "Son," he said, and the word had been parked in Kyle's mouth the way a lit cigarette is between the fingers. So when it came out, everybody heard the smoke. And then Mrs. Delcroix heard it too. She let out a sound like someone who had been given instructions in a language she didn't understand. She stepped forward on the plank and then stopped, because something in the air told her not to cross. "Wait," I said. I should have put the engine in neutral. I should have muscled everyone back with the kind of authority you learn in Coast Guard classes. But there is a different kind of authority down here. Sometimes the swamp has you by the throat, and you cannot justify the cruelty of your next breath. Thomas called again, his voice weaving like kelp. The water around his skiff glinted full of other faces. Small, smiling, sometimes laughing youngsters who looked like echoes but were the real thing in their own timeline. He reached for Kyle, and Kyle reached back. The third rule, don't sleep where water remembers your name, thudded in my skull like a hammer I'd been ignoring. I didn't know then that the swamp doesn't hand you a reunion without a receipt. It asks you, in a half-merciful, half-vindictive way, to pay. It asks for names. It asks you to speak into water and boil it until it remembers you the way a confession remembers sins. It asks you to offer things on a third plank. I reached for the tiller with a man's reflex. You pull a boat sideways when you want to keep people off a dock. You don't touch a dock until it shows itself to be an honest one. But Kyle did not wait. He moved as if the years between him and his father were a string he could shorten by simply tugging. He jumped to a smaller skiff that had once, evidently, been tethered to Thomas's boat. It detached. He crouched. I wanted to shout stop. I wanted to tell him about the paper and the rules. Instead, my throat filled with the smell of tidal mud and boiled coffee and fear. The thing that keeps guides in the game is the idea that the world will answer to your competence. Tonight, competence was a rumor. Kyle cut across the water like a man trying to stitch himself to a missing seam. Thomas reached out and brushed his son's shoulder. For one flock of heartbeats, the world was ordinary. Reunions are loud and messy and beautiful.
They fold the world into a small, imperfect knot. Then the echo walkers came. They did not arrive with a trumpet. They arrived as reflections that wanted contact. They came as many faces, like the surface of the water had been taught to mimic grief. They stepped sideways off the skiffs, hollow and patient, and the water smelled suddenly like a mouth that had not been brushed in a week. A low sound ran through the cypress swamp, a hum that vibrated the marrow. The airboat shuddered. "You should have kept your hands on the tiller," someone said behind me. It was Luciana. She had the clinical rage of someone who sees data on a grid and knows what the axis is. "We keep the family together," Kyle said, but his hands were shaking. The paper was in one pocket, his fingers over it like a clasp. Like the rest of us, he had learned 100 rules all his life. He was about to learn which rules were allowed and which were demanded. The echoed men moved like puppets that had cut their strings and learned to walk with their own deliberation. Thomas Denning stood between them and smiled a smile that was slightly crooked and a little small for his face. He looked at me once, as if to say the universe was finally correct. Then he said something that I cannot forget. "They remember our promises. They remember the names we never spoke." I lifted the tiller because there is an instinct older than fear when someone you love reaches for what will take them away. I tried to cut the wake between Thomas and the echo walkers. The boat slid. The water erupted in a spray of silver that smelled like fish oil and old coins. The echo nearest me, my echo, screeched and dissolved into a line of bubbles. When I looked up, Kyle was gone.
Not gone in the sense of left or vanished like a bad day. Gone in the sense of blinked out. One heartbeat he was on the skiff, leaning forward with his hand out, and the next, the skiff was empty except for a folded jacket and the paper. Thomas stood with the look of a man who had been given an offering. He held up his hands like someone who had been given a gift and had no reason to demand more. Then, as if remembering some etiquette he had delayed, he pushed the skiff back toward the far reeds and rowed away into a channel that should not have been there. We chased, because what else do you do? We ran the engine like a heart, trying not to fall out. The swamp filled the air with a thick hum, a bruised sky pressing down. The echo walkers did not follow. They watched us go with the patience of predators that know they have more time than you do. On the way back, the boat passed under an arch of dead cypress that we had passed 3 times before. It seemed a small miracle that the boat and the world were still where they were. We found the smaller skiff by the reeds, half drowned and full of mud, and inside it, where Kyle had stood, there was nothing but his jacket and the paper folded twice. His jacket still smelled like him. I held it to my face because you do that with absent things. You hope to conjure their heat. The paper, the rules, were wet at the edges as if someone had cried on them. I unfolded it with a gloved finger. The handwriting on the back had a single word in a different pen, in an ink that was not quite the same as the rest. I read it aloud because there are confessions you need to share. Marlene. It sank in like a stone. Marlene was the name I had carried and never spoken. Not to my ex-wife, not to my brother, not to the woman whose son I had helped raise and then let slip down the river. The name was curdled in the molars of memory. It tasted like a debt. We beached the boat again and made a new plan, because being professionals in a place that was not professional requires improvisation. There are things you cannot control, the swamp's appetite for names, the way it rearranges time. There are things you can do. Keep the group intact, stop the spread of panic, hold a lantern high so the trees have to respect you as human. We made small rules. No one goes alone. No one answers for another's name. No one leaves anything on the dock unless we all agree. We did not test the truth of Kyle's paper because we did not have the luxury of belief. We tested it because we were obliged. That was when the sound started. A low, slow clapping, like an applause from a group of dead things. The sky was a bruise now, purple tending toward black, and in the bruise something small and hungry lived.
It pulsed over the cypress tops like a slow animal breathing. We were at the edge of the death trail, and the swamp had begun to keep time we couldn't read. I took out the only thing I knew might anchor me, my grandfather's watch. It was a cheap thing, mechanical, tarnished, with a crack in the glass the size of a crescent moon. My uncle had given it to me when I left home. He said it would keep you honest and keep you on schedule. The second hand had jammed a year ago, and I'd left it because it was sentimental nonsense. That day, with the compass dead and the GPS a liar, the watch clicked once and then again. The hand shivered like a pulse. It did not move properly. It did not have to. It had to be there. We found a line of birds like punctuation marks along the trail. Their feathers were silver in the bruised sky. They turned their heads and watched us like an audience. Mrs. Delqua finally let go of the straw hat in her lap and clutched a small paper picture. She held it out and said the name in a voice like moss. "Joshua," she whispered, and the swamp answered with a ripple the color of old pennies. We remembered then that names had weight. They were mortgages the lost could not afford to let go. We had to make choices. The guide of a swamp is a judge in a courtroom that does not hear appeals. There was a dock that Kyle had described on his paper, a cypress dock with the third plank rotted and the rest solid. It was the center, the place Mary Billy had circled on the page with a blunt stick. To get to it meant following the death trail. To stand on it meant the swamp would demand names, offerings, and boiled water like a ledger. To do nothing might mean leaving people in a time that was not their own. I am practical, folks. I measure fuel in gallons and lives in head counts. But I also carry the weight of things I failed to say. There are names tucked in my pocket that I have been too proud to pay. So we set a course. We tied lures to our belts, flares in reach, blades in a box. We did not have a plan beyond moving forward. The swamp rearranges the map when it wants. Our charts were polite suggestions. We moved like men with a single thing in front of us, the third plank, the dock with its offering. I do not promise you heroism. I promise you truth. I did what any guide does when the ledger insists. Keep people alive, keep the list of names honest, and never, ever answer the swamp's questions with a voice it can keep. We paddled into the channel that seemed to want to keep us. The dead birds watched like judges. The water hummed with the memory of many things. And as we slid closer, I remembered the name in my pocket like a hot coal in my fist. I thought of Marlene and of the things not said, and of the way a person's absence will claim you if you let it. The paper folded in Kyle's jacket was wet and warm. The guide's hand is steady until it isn't. The swamp is patient. The docks are waiting. We were about to learn how patient. We nosed up to the cypress dock as if it had been waiting for us with a patience that felt like malice. It was small, 3 planks jutting from rotted roots into a pool the swamp had kept like a cupped malm. The third plank sagged, the wood gray and flaked, a dark scar where generations of offerings had set and softened. Bits of string and rusted wire were tangled in the roots. Someone, Mary Billy, the paper said, though her name is legend and not a map, had once marked this place with a small stone and a circle of shell. The circle was still there, half buried in mud, a gesture older than any of us that asked for something back. We tied the boat short, 3 knots in a row, because 3 feels more insistent than 2, and superstition is a kind of map. The water under the dock was slow and black, full of the smell of musk and old rain. The skiff Thomas had used leaned on one side like a sleeping child. The air felt thicker here, as if all the voices that had threaded through the swamp had been gathered and put on a shelf to be measured against tonight. We stepped from the boat with the careful cadence of people who know the sound a dock makes when it will not hold you for long. Kyle's jacket, folded where he had stood, was damp but still warm, as if someone had pressed a hand into it and left their heat. He watched the dock the way a man watches a ledger he cannot balance. Before any of us could say a rational word, Wayne, a man who had been practical about cameras but sentimental about trinkets, fumbled at his pocket and set down a small object on the plank. It was a watch, brass and pitted, the glass cracked like an old smile. He must have picked it up earlier from the rusted skiff or the lunchbox. A thing that had the shape of a gift, even when it was old enough to have belonged to another lifetime. He set it down like an apology. "I found it in that skiff," he said, as if announcing contraband. "Thought it might be useful." Rule 4 registered in my head with the ease of muscle memory. Do not break any offering left for the center. The paper had been clear. The swamp kept ledgers. You don't tidy someone's grave because you think you're doing them a favor. Wayne's fingers had closed on something that wasn't his. The doc did not like that. Kyle looked at the watch and then at Wayne, and something in him unhinged a little. "You shouldn't touch them," he said. He hadn't known then that the thing he said sounded like accusation. Wayne's face tightened. "I wasn't trying to steal anything." He set his hands open on the plank, like a man showing palms in court. Around us, the swamp listened. I had the old watch my uncle had given me, across my palm. My grandfather's watch, the one I'd worn out of sentiment, felt heavier than it had 100 times before. I could hear it in my bones. "Keep the list honest, Ray. There are names you don't get to borrow from other people. If the swamp asks a favor, you don't take it and hope you can put it back when no one's looking." We cleared the third plank and sat in a tight circle on the dock, knees touching. The water below was a black plate, reflecting us back in a way that was shamefully accurate.
Luciana set her small stove on a flat section and began the ritual of boiling water with fingers that were used to exact temps and sterile surfaces. There was nothing about this I trusted, but the ceremony itself steadied us. Doing something made us less prey to the unmeasurable. We boiled water twice while we argued about what constituted an offering. Mrs. Delcroix had handed me a thing so small it could have been a memory, a folded photograph, the edges soft as breathing. Patty and Wayne had an old coin and a rosary bead, small tokens that cost the swamp nothing but meant everything. Luciana, with the scientist's thorn of propriety, placed a sealed jar in front of her, containing a scrap of handwriting from someone whose name she didn't know. "Everyone here has something they owe," Kyle said softly. He kept his voice low because he had been taught the hard lesson that sound is a currency the swamp keeps tally of. You can't give a name you stole. It has to be a name you carry. Names in that place were not nouns. They were weights. Saying someone's name aloud was handing a ledger a coin it could not refuse. I felt mine, a hot coal in the backside of my throat. Marlene. The syllable sat like a regret shaped into a proper noun. I had never spoken it to the woman who had been bone and blood to a child I never met. I had let time stack between us, and the swamp had kept the receipt. We boiled the water a third time because Kyle read the paper aloud, and the paper said 3. Luciana's metal cup sang as the bubbles gathered. When the water first started to shimmer, a thin vapor rose and the light around us bent a degree darker, like the air taking a breath. The watch Wayne had laid at the edge of the plank hiccuped. It shivered and began to tick as if some latent spring inside had been wound by the very act of touching the dock. I put my grandfather's watch down on the third plank myself. I did it because not John, my uncle, had taught me to gamble small and pay big when it comes to debts you carry. I placed it beside Wayne's find, a small pen of metal offering between us. Someone drew a line on the old paper that Kyle kept. "Make the left side a place to put things," he had written once. "Make the right side a place to put names." It felt like trying to balance a checkbook while a hurricane measured your hand. Rule 5 was the loudest in our circle. Speak it into boiled water 3 times and let the words sink. Names must be spoken thrice, and drunk, the paper said, as if the swamp required not just the sound, but the substance of acknowledgement. People in other stories throw flowers and candles.
The Everglades asks for syllables and heat. I do not think most of us realized then how literal it was going to be. Saying someone's name into a cup of water, dry syllables wrapped in fingers, was private but public in a swamp that made privacy a thin curtain. The first person to speak was Mrs. Delcroix. She unfolded the photograph like a Bible and looked at it like somebody who reads scripture for pronunciation. She cupped the hot metal cup with both hands and placed the paper to her lips. "Joshua," she said once, and the word came like a stone into the quiet water. She drank. Her hands shook. She said it again, and a third time. I watched the surface of the water where the name had struck. For a moment, the cup glowed faintly, like a vein under skin. Then a ripple ran across the pool beneath us, a small ring that moved with polite speed, and then stopped as if something had answered and then declined to speak. Wayne, ashamed, said his name next. He murmured for a boy who had been his brother, a name that smelled of sand and barbecue. Patty said a sister's name. Luciana, clinical until the end, bent like a scientist performing the last experiment of her life, and said the name of a mentor who had taught her how to dissect a problem. Their names hit the water like pebbles. When it was his turn, Kyle did not speak Thomas's name. He spoke instead the name of a woman he said had been kind to him during the days he had been lost the first time. Miri, a name I had not heard before. He spoke it with the sound of a man who had already paid a fee and was now paying the interest. Each time a name was spoken thrice and the water drunk, the air seemed to collect the syllable and hold it like a person holding a baby. When it was my turn, I almost did not. My throat closed. The name, Marlene, tasted like iron. I had memories with her, but memories that had been light as cigarette smoke, and then sharpened into a knife by time. She had left a long time ago. The evidence of her life had been folded into other people's lives and then given away. I had made myself a ledger of excuses. When I lifted the cup, my hands were steady only because being steady is the shape a guide takes when fear wants to crawl into your pockets. I said her name once, and the water stilled around the rim. I drank. I said it a second time, and my mouth was hot with tears I had not expected. On the third, my voice broke in a way that was both release and confession. The water in the cup shivered like a throat clearing. For a heartbeat, I imagined Marlene herself, small, stubborn, the shape of the things I had not said. And then the water took the name and sank it like a pebble under ice. Something shifted when the last names were spoken. The two watches on the plank, Wayne's found piece and my grandfather's, began to tick louder, not in time with each other, but in time with the world around us. The bruted purple over the cypress thickened. You could see it press along the moss like bruising. It hummed the way a closed door hums when someone on the other side is breathing. We had met the conditions the paper required. We had placed offerings, we had spoken names into boiled water thrice, and we had put metal timepieces on the plank as witnesses. The swamp had no debts, it had ledgers.
But ledger-keeping is a communal experience down there. It will accept gratitude as payment. It will prefer payment in the currency it knows best. And then it decided it would not accept the kindness of strangers. There was a keening from below the water, like someone running a finger round the inside of a giant empty glass. The dock trembled. From the dark under the roots, something rose, a slow, bulging motion that displaced old leaves and made the air smell like subways after rain. The drowned things do not appear with a sound. They arrive the way cold arrives, a pressure, a gray bloom in the senses that crawls under your skin. They were not monsters in human form. They were not grotesque in the sense of gore. They were old water memories made solid enough to touch. The suggestion of a face with the wrong eyes, hands that imitated motion but lacked agreement, and a wetness that made sound like someone rubbing cloth over metal. They moved by suction and history. They came from channels we had not seen, smelling of old coins and peeled paint, and they wanted the names we had spoken. It is hard to put into words the way the world tilts when a thing that has had only memory becomes cruelly concrete. The first of them rose at the edge of the dock, its silhouette a smudge that had learned to be human. Water ran from it in slow, thick strings. It reached for the plank with a hand like a leaf. We shouted names then, not to call the things, but to keep our voices loud. Calling names in that moment is not a request. It is an anchor. Rule 6 came into play like an executioner's timetable. The sky bruised purple enough now that the bruise tasted metallic, and we could feel the swell of a time that had decided to press in and take us. The drowned shapes moved sideways, their hands becoming hands with the ambition to possess. When one reached for the plank, there was a small physical pulling at the wood, as if the dock itself were a seam being unpicked. Wayne's watch began to glow. It sang with an odd internal light. It sounded almost like a bell inside a cellar. The hand of the small brass watch spun faster and faster until the glass cracked in a spiderweb, and the dial flared with a light like a trapped star. Wayne, whose face had been apologetic all afternoon, grabbed for it. I grabbed his wrist. "You can't," I said, and there was no time to be gentle. Wayne met my eyes, and in that quick movement, I saw regret sharpen into terror. He understood the rule he had broken and the price it would levy. He let go of the watch. Then my grandfather's watch began to move differently. The second hand, which had been stuck for a year, spun like a small planet coming free of its orbit. The metal was warm against the plank. It had something of the glow of a heart that has decided to start again. The water under us screamed in a frequency that made the teeth ache. The drowned things recoiled slightly, like animals sensing a threat in an otherwise indifferent world. "They want names," Kyle said. His voice had the bright edge of someone who has made their bargain and is trying to enforce the terms. "They want the debt paid. Give them names. Name them and anchor them." We began to speak in a shape we could not have scripted. It was not a ceremony, but a salvage. We read names like listings in a census: Joshua, Marlene, Miri, Luis, Elena. Some names belonged to the people on the dock. Some belonged to others, voices the swamp had kept on its shelf for years. When a name struck the water a second time, a ripple rose that had the shape of a hand. On the third sound, a ghost of a person would bloom on the far edge of the channel, soliding like a dream that forgot it was dreamt. Thomas Denning's skiff, moored out in the channel, rocked as if a hand had touched its stern. The man on it, Thomas himself now, but older, weathered by decades of waiting, stood up straighter as if a weight had been taken from his shoulders. He reached for a water that had not been his, and drank, whispering a name I did not hear, and then he pointed. From the other side of the dock, the drowned things pressed closer, in a hush that felt like applause. One of them, an outline meant to be female, kept reaching toward Kyle. It mimed his face and his voice, an echo with the wrong punctuation. It wanted to trade Kyle's name for something else. Kyle screamed then, a raw sound that folded space, and he grabbed the paper from his pocket and read Thomas's name aloud into his empty hands until the sound shook like a beehive. The ritual was messy and human. People forgot which names they had spoken twice. Someone coughed into the cup and then laughed hysterically. When a name was spoken and the water swallowed it, the place around us lightened like a shutter opening. A person would appear across the channel, blinking like a thing waked from anesthesia. Once the name had form, it had rights. It had a gravity the swamp sometimes relented to. That is the mercy of the ledger. It recognizes the legitimacy of callers who pay honestly. But for every honest currency, there can be counterfeit. Wayne's earlier theft had muddied the pool.
The watch he'd picked up from the skiff was not his to offer. It was part of someone else's debt. The swamp does not forgive stealing the gifts of the lost. It punishes them by making other things hungry. The drowned things began to act like scavengers at the edge of a feast. They lunged, not with teeth, but with the longing of absence. They tried to mouth names from tongues that had not said them. They pressed on the planks with hands that were like leaves rubbing against wood. For every name we gave, for every person we freed, the drowned things demanded another coin. Fire became our language.
Patty had the flare tucked in her belt from the boat's emergency kit. She lit it, and it flared not like a tourist prop, but like an annunciation. Its light scraped the wet shape's back. The shriek of the flare made the water recoil as if it had been slapped. We used oars and flares, the kind of rough implements a boat carries, because the world sometimes asks you to be a carpenter and a soldier at the same time. Luciana, always the scientist, did not cry until she did. She stood and shouted the name of a man she'd known in classes, a man who had taught her the curvature of a fin and the poetry of cartilage. The drowned thing that had been mimicking him unpeeled like see-through cloth and ran back into the channel, unraveling into silt and the smell of old fish. Thomas Denning, who had once looked as if he'd been carved from the riverbank itself, shouted his own name. He stepped off his skiff with the uncertain gait of someone who had been given back their body and then forgot how to use it. Kyle, who had been gone and then had been vaguely present, appeared beside us with his jacket beside him, as if he had returned into the world wearing a different pocket. For all the traumaticness of the moment, he was real. You could see him blink and wipe his eyes. He was smaller by memory and larger by the presence of a man who had been found. Then the thing we had feared took another shape. A cluster of drowned things, older by their being and more cohesive, rose from the darkest channel like a congregation. They had the shape of many faces fused into one echo. The water around them boiled with the scent of copper. They pressed outward on the dock, and the plank bowed, threatening to break. It was then that the watches answered in a way I had not expected. My grandfather's watch, the one I had dropped onto the third plank like a confession, began to ring a sound that was not like a watch, but like a choir of small, clean notes. The brass one Wayne had found flashed like a tiny thunderhead, and then shattered in a bloom of pinprick light. The air filled with the sound of 100 tiny alarms being set off at once. The watches did not explode like bombs. They answered the ledger. They gave light that was not mere brightness, but the sort of illumination that reveals things for what they are. The drowned things recoiled from it like animals from sunlight. When the light touched one of the hollow faces, it did not melt so much as be allowed to go back to a shape that remembered living. An old man who had once fished off the same dock, a girl who had fallen in by accident and been kept like a photograph. Where light touched, memory became person again. But it was violent in its outcome. The plank cracked with a sound like a dry laugh. The third plank, sagging, dark, let go, and a small wave of water and rotten wood knocked us off balance. The dock shifted. Kyle fell, and I grabbed for him and somehow found the balance to hold his weight. But the plank had offered its last service. In the aftermath of that small collapse, the light from the watches coalesced into something no longer wearable and then released like a small star. It shot out across the channel with a soft, sizzling hush and struck the dark water. Where it landed, a ripple of people rose, not ghosts, but flesh and water and hair, some of them wearing clothes from another decade, some with the faint impression of things that had been lost long ago. They rose like sailors from a submerged past and began to speak names aloud, calling each other and the living by the words they'd been waiting to hear. Rescue began in a way that was almost mundane. Boats rose out of channels like forgotten memories coming home. Some were old models, a skiff older than anything I'd seen in my years on the trail, others newer. Men and women climbed aboard and spoke with accents of years we couldn't place.
They took aside children who had been found, hugged them, asked them about their mothers and fathers as if they had only been late for supper. There was crying, loud, surprised, grateful, and then a rational follow-up of paper and lists. We were all deliriously grateful and terrifyingly small. The drowned things did not all vanish at once. Some shrank back into the mud. Some turned to sludge that smelled of riverbank and then dissolved. The air had the strange clarity of a room after a window is opened. The bruise of the sky began to fade where the watch's light had reached, as if the ledger had been satisfied for the moment. When it was over, there were bodies in my boat that had been missing for decades, and decades of names that matched them. There were tears and reunions, and people who had been supposed to be running errands in 1974 suddenly standing on a dock in 2023 with coupons in their pocket that had been out of date for 39 years. Authorities came later, boats with uniforms and forms, perplexed and solemn. They took down names. They took photographs of people who had been a story and were now reporters at breakfast. In the scramble, Kyle was found. He was muddy and thinner, his jacket filled with small things he had picked up on the way. A child's marble, a wristband, a note in a handwriting I didn't recognize. He came to me and put a hand on my shoulder in a way that said both thank you and accusation. I had deserved both. His father, Thomas, embraced him like a man making up for lost rent. Later, when the official people had counted and cataloged, and the swamp seemed to be deciding its mood, Kyle came up to me in the wash of diesel and paper. He held out his folded bit of paper and a small apology. "You should have told me," he said. "You should have been patient," I replied. We were both right. There is always a ledger. I went home that night with my grandfather's watch in a cardboard box under my arm like contraband.
The Tomiyami was smudged with the late light of a day that did not remember itself properly. News vans were already parked along the shoulder, and people with phones kept stopping like pilgrims outside a cathedral, hoping to glance and be cleansed. For a while, I sat in my kitchen and listened to the second hand tick in a manner that had nothing to do with the present time and everything to do with the one that kept its own hours. In the days that followed, the Coopertown docks were a place you could get lost in bureaucracy. People in suits and official things came. There were interviews and forms. Fishermen who had found their sons on boats that looked like relics and were returned with accents of other decades spoke softly into microphones, stunned by the permission to be human again. If a line is drawn, the line was between those who left something on a plank and those who had never learned the value of a name. Mrs. Delcroix, Eleanor, left with a photograph taped to her chest. She told the story of Joshua's voice like someone perpetually astonished. Kyle took his father home, said that he would let him learn the lost years as if learning a language. Luciana went on to publish a paper about auditory layering and memory frequencies and made the academic rounds. Patty and Wayne went home with a scar in their marriage that would not scab over but might someday be worth less than it was. The federal people took statements and made lists and tried to label everything with a heading and a date. But lists do not hold mysteries very long. They just try to keep them neat. The swamp returned to being the swamp. Within a week, the bruise in the sky was a story people read over coffee. The dock was repaired by men who come with nails and new planks and the kind of reverence you offer a place you have seen make decisions. Mary Billy was paged in a way that turned folklore into an interview she never asked for. She gave no ethnography. She gave only the story elements she felt were safe and left the rest as legend. It was right. As for me, the guide whose watch had become an offering and whose old names had been pulled back into the light, I went back to work. People want to know what to expect when they get on a boat. They want demonstrations of herons and explanations of sawgrass. They want the predictable, the lift of an eagle, the speed of an airboat, the way a marsh will drown your audio if you lean too close to history. I gave them the usual observations and left out how the sun had stopped and the compass circled like a confused insect.
I could not, would not make it a commercial. But I came home different. There is no better way to say it. Something had been burned out of me, and something else had grown into the empty place. I had said a name aloud, and the name had come back with a new texture. I had paid a debt and found relief. Yet relief was small. Guilt does not evaporate just because the ledger has been balanced. It mutters under the pillow.
Weeks later, while the world still turned the story into a manageable headline, a woman came to the Coopertown dock and asked for me by name. She was middle-aged, with hands that had worked and a face that fit memory like a key fits a lock. She had a photograph of a woman I had loved once, Marlene, and in a small, dry voice she said, "My name is Rosa. They used to call me the farm girl. My mother, Marlene, told me once about a man who liked the marsh and kept a watch." That is how you find a child you never knew, not with fanfare, but with a stranger who holds a photograph and an improbable fact. She told me stories of small thefts of the heart, someone lending sugar, someone promising to write and not doing so, and then she turned the photograph toward me, and there was an ache that could not be hidden. She said, "You were listed in her things. She kept a receipt." We did not explode in holy reunion. There was no single tear of repentance that solved 20 years of absence, but she sat and drank coffee with me at a table that had my grandfather's scratches and told me about her life. A marriage that had holes, children who had grown like stray seeds, work that had been hard and honest. Rosa, my daughter by another name, asked questions with the reserved caution of someone who has been handed a map with no legend. I tried to answer like a man who had learned a ledger's language. There is a particular smallness in the admission of failure. I told her what I could without casting blame on people who had, frankly, had their own survival to manage. I apologized for the ways absence had been my inheritance. She listened, and then, in a way that surprised me, she told me that forgiveness is something like an old boat. You repair a plank at a time, and sometimes the boat will never be seaworthy again, but you can learn to use it to cross small rivers. We did not become a family because a story demanded it. We became a family because adults learned to share a life without illusions. She came around sometimes when I had day tours. She brought Rosa, my granddaughter, bright and suspicious of things, and we trudged the palmettos with a kind of mutual politeness that felt, achingly, like the first steps of something that might one day be called trust. The Everglades keeps its ledger. It shows up with its own ideas about justice and debt. But human ledgers pile as well. Apologies unpaid, birthdays missed, the small accumulating rot of not saying a name. I had paid one debt on a dock with a watch and a cup of boiled water, but there were still obligations in the ordinary world. Calls to make, birthdays to not miss, a granddaughter to learn the way she prefers her pancakes. The swamp had given me a second chance, and I had spent it slowly, like a man learning to hold a fragile coin. I go back to the water because I am what I am, Ray of Coopertown. I run tours, and sometimes I tell the story, but never the details people cannot hold. I tell it like a parable with too much truth, that the swamp does not forgive the casual theft of memory, that it asks you to be precise with names, and that it will, sometimes, present you with the lost and allow you to get them back if you are willing to pay with what you own. Sometimes, on nights when the cypress are like black teeth, and the sun sits wrong, and the tide runs with a memory in its mouth, I stand at the bow and listen. The grass looks like an ocean, and the ocean looks like a ledger. The echo walkers still practice on the edges of my wake. I turn my back on them because the first lesson holds. Do not give them your reflection. Do not answer for an absence you did not cause, and learn to carry your names like currency. If you ever come out with me, and people do once in a while, because the swamp has a way of making believers out of skeptics, I'll show you the dock from a safe distance. I'll tell you, if I must, the rules Kyle read from the old paper and the way a watch will sometimes ring like an answered prayer. But I'll also tell you that this is a story not because it is miraculous, but because it asks a question we all answer in our private ways. What names have you let sit unpaid? There are people who will try to make it a tourist brand, themed watches and postcards and guided thin place walks. I will not sell that. The swamp is not a backdrop for kitsch. It is indifferent and dangerous and occasionally merciful. It taught me humility in the way it teaches all who linger too long, by returning what you have lost in a manner that insists you will now be responsible for it. We did what we could on that dock. We paid with small, honest things. We spoke names and drank them into hot metal, and the swamp spit back what had been trapped there for years. It gave Kyle his father back and Mrs. Delcroix her Joshua. It returned men and women to streets that had advanced without them and left behind the echo of a bruised sky to be told and retold. And it gave me, finally, an impossible gift, a daughter who once kept a picture of a man with a stubborn, sentimental watch. The Everglades will always be the place of thin things, laughter that turns to wind, a sun that sometimes stops, a compass that can spiral with the wrong thought. Being a boat tour guide here is mostly being practical, an expert in throttle and tide, a teller of bird facts, a manager of cooler snacks, until the day when your competence is not enough and you must pay with a name. If you liked this kind of story and want more that walk the line between local folklore and the impossible, consider subscribing and telling me in the comments a name or a thin place you've heard about, something small and strange held like a coin in your pocket. I read them, and sometimes, in the quiet between tours, I think about the ledgers we keep and the names we owe. The swamp keeps its own books. I keep mine. The watches on the dock are gone now. The third plank has been replaced with new wood and new nails. The scar in the sky heals into ordinary weather. But every so often, when the sun sits wrong and the mosquitoes begin their evening accounting, I find my hand going to my pocket, and I feel the old tick of a watch that no longer tells only the time, but reminds me of the cost of silence.